Commander Yeltris stood before the observation window of Sentinel Station Keth-9 and watched the stars disappear one by one. She had 4 arms like all Talori, and her crystalline skin reflected the dim emergency lights that now bathed the station. In red warning colors, for 10,000 years, the Galactic Concord had maintained peace across 100,000 worlds, and 17 intelligent species had learned to live together in harmony. War was a forgotten concept, and weapons existed only in museums and history files that nobody bothered to read anymore. The great fleets of the Concord were ceremonial things with golden hulls and decorative cannons that had never fired a single shot. In anger, diplomacy solved all problems, and trade made everyone wealthy, and there was simply no need for violence in a galaxy that had evolved beyond such primitive behavior. Now something was eating the stars. The first reports had come from the outer colonies 3 weeks ago, and Yeltris remembered reading them with confusion rather than fear. Mining station had gone silent, and then a small agricultural world had stopped responding to communications. The Concord had sent diplomats because that was what the Concord always did when problems arose. Those diplomats never returned. The Vorthan swarm emerged from the darkness between galaxies like a plague of living nightmares. And their ships were not made of metal, but of flesh and bone and hunger. Billions of them moved through space in formations that looked like storm clouds, and they consumed everything in their path. Planets were stripped bare in days, and populations vanished without a trace. And the Vorthan never responded to any attempt at communication. They simply fed Yeltris and watched the fall of 3 colony worlds from her station, and each time she had sent urgent messages to the Concord High Council, begging for help. 17 species received her distress beacon, and 15 of them responded with deep regret and sincere apologies. Their ships were unarmed, they explained, and their people had no training in combat, and their cultures had forgotten how to fight. Generations ago, they offered thoughts and prayers and promises to remember the fallen with dignity too. Species did not respond at all. One of them was a race of beings called humans who lived in a small cluster of systems near the galactic edge. Yeltris had heard rumors about the humans over the years, and every species in the Concord had similar stories that they shared in whispers. The humans were young and had only been traveling among the stars for about 5 centuries, which made them infants compared to the ancient civilizations of the Concord. They kept to themselves mostly and traded fairly, and smiled a great deal, even when smiling made no sense. They were friendly and curious and helpful in small ways, and nobody considered them particularly important or powerful. But there were other rumors too, and these came from old files that had been sealed and forgotten after first contact. Yeltris had read one of those files once when she was a young officer, and she remembered a single warning that made no sense to her at the time. The file said simply that one should never mistake human kindness for weakness, and never mistake human patience for inability. She had laughed at that warning because the humans seemed so harmless and ordinary and unremarkable in every way. They were not the oldest species or the wisest or the most technologically advanced, and their little corner of the galaxy was considered a backwater by most serious scholars. Now, as she watched the Vorthan swarm approaching her station, Yeltris found herself thinking about those old warnings. The swarm would reach Keth-9 in less than 6 hours, and there was nowhere to run and nothing to fight with her. Station held 12,000 souls, including scientists and diplomats and families, who had come to study the beautiful nebula that surrounded them. There were children in the lower levels who had never seen their homeworlds and who would now never get the chance. Yeltris had armed her scientists with mining lasers that were designed to cut through rock rather than flesh. Her diplomats had become medics and were preparing to treat wounds that they had only read about in ancient texts. So everyone knew that these preparations were meaningless, and that the Vorthan would overwhelm them in minutes once the attack began. But they prepared anyway, because doing nothing felt worse than doing something hopeless. The children had been gathered in the deepest cargo bays where the walls were thickest, and where they might survive a few minutes longer than everyone else. Eltress had visited them an hour ago, and she had smiled and told them that everything would be fine. She was not very good at lying, but the children seemed to believe her, or perhaps they simply wanted to believe one. Small Tollery girl had grabbed her arm with tiny crystalline fingers and asked if the heroes were coming to save them. The Eltress had not known how to answer that question because she did not believe in heroes and had never needed to believe in heroes. Until now, the galaxy had been safe for so long that the very concept of rescue seemed like something from old stories that parents told their children, but she had nodded and said yes, and hoped that the lie would comfort the girl for whatever time remained. Now, Eltress stood alone at the observation window and composed one final message. She did not send it to the Concord, because the Concord had already failed them, and there was no point in begging those who could not help. Instead, she aimed her transmission at the small cluster of stars where the humans lived, and she spoke in simple words that her translator could easily convert. She said that her station was under attack and that 12,000 innocent people would die within hours. She said that she had nowhere else to turn and no other options left. She said that the children were asking about heroes, and she did not know what to tell them. And then she said the only words that seemed to matter. She said, "We need help," and she said, "Please." The transmission vanished into the darkness of space, and Eltress watched it go with no real hope that anyone would hear. The humans were so far away and so small and so seemingly powerless against the horror that was coming. But she had asked, and that was all she could do. She turned away from the window and went to join her people for whatever came next. Behind her, the stars continued to disappear one by one as the swarm drew closer, and somewhere across the vast emptiness of space, a message traveled toward a small blue world that the universe had underestimated. For 500 years, 3 days passed and nothing happened. The Vorten swarm had reached Sentinel Station, Keth 9, and begun their assault, and the station was dying slowly under the endless Alex. Eltress had stopped sleeping because every time she closed her eyes, she heard the screams of her people and the grinding sound of alien ships tearing through their outer. All the mining lasers had proven surprisingly effective for about 2 hours, and her scientists had actually managed to destroy several smaller Vorten vessels before the swarm adapted. Now the lasers did nothing except make the Vorten angry, and the creatures seemed to take pleasure in prolonging the destruction. They could have finished the station in minutes, but instead they were taking it apart piece by piece like predators playing with wounded prey. The outer ring had been breached on the first day, and 40 people had died when the atmosphere vented into space. Eltress had ordered everyone to fall back to the central hub, and they had sealed the doors and prayed to gods that most of them had stopped believing in centuries ago. Second day brought more attacks and more deaths and more desperate attempts to hold back the tide. A young Brevian engineer named Koss had sacrificed himself to seal a breach in the medical bay, and his last words had been an apology for not being bravery. Eltress had told him he was the bravest person she had ever known, and she meant it with all her heart. By the third day, hope had become a memory, and the survivors were simply waiting for the end. Children in the cargo bay had stopped asking about heroes and started asking when their parents would come to get them. Some of those parents were already dead, and Eltress did not know how to explain that to creatures so young and innocent. She stood at her command station with her 4 arms hanging limp at her sides and watched the tactical display show more and more red warning lights. The power was failing and the life support was struggling, and they had maybe 6 hours left before the station became a tomb. Then something changed. A flash of light appeared at the edge of her sensors, and Eltress assumed it was another wave of Vorten ships coming to finish them off, but the readings made no sense because this new contact was coming from the wrong direction. The Vorten came from the galactic rim, But this ship had emerged from hyperspace on the opposite side, near the core worlds, and it was not a Vorthan ship. Vessel that appeared on her screen was unlike anything in the Concord registry, and it was not elegant or beautiful or ceremonial in any way. It was a brutal thing of harsh angles and heavy armor, and it bristled with weapons that Yeltris could not even identify. Scars covered its hull in patterns that spoke of countless battles, and the metal had been repaired so many times that it looked like a patchwork of determination and defiance. The ship should not exist because the Concord had banned weapons of war 10,000 years ago, and no species was supposed to have vessels like this. But there it was hanging in space like an answer to a prayer that Yeltris had not dared to speak of. Transmission crackled through her damaged communications system, and a voice spoke in calm and measured tones. The voice belonged to a female human, and she introduced herself as Captain Elena Vasquez of the Terran vessel Perseverance. She said that they had received a distress call and that they had come as quickly as they could. She said that they had brought friends. Yeltris stared at her screen and watched as more ships emerged from hyperspace behind the Perseverance first. There were dozens and then hundreds, and then she lost count as the fleet continued to grow. Carriers and destroyers and frigates and cruisers poured out of hyperspace in formations that spoke of discipline and training and centuries of preparation. These were not ceremonial ships with golden hulls and decorative weapons. These were warships that had been built for a single purpose, and that purpose was violence. The Concord had always believed that humanity was a minor species with no real power or importance in galactic affairs. The Concord had been wrong. Captain Vasquez spoke again, and her voice carried a warmth that seemed strange coming from someone commanding such terrifying machines. She asked about the status of the station and the number of survivors and the condition of the wounded. She asked about the children when Yeltris told her that over 300 children were huddled in the cargo bay waiting to die. The captain went quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke a single word that Yeltris had never heard before. The word was cavalry, and her translator struggled to find an equivalent in any Concord language. The closest it could manage was an old phrase that meant those who come when all hope is lost. The human fleet began to move, and the Vorthan swarm turned to face this new threat with what might have been confusion. They had never encountered resistance before, and they did not seem to understand what was happening. First, human missiles struck the swarm with nuclear fire that lit up the darkness like a new sun. Vorthan ships died by the thousands in seconds, and the swarm recoiled from the assault like a wounded animal. Captain Vasquez spoke to her fleet in a language of codes and commands that Yeltris could not follow, but she understood the tone perfectly because it was the voice of someone who had done this before and who knew exactly what she was doing. The battle for Keth9 had begun, and for the first time in 3 days, Yeltris felt something she had forgotten was possible. She felt hope, and in the cargo bay, below 300 children heard the explosions and saw the lights and asked their caretakers what was happening. The caretakers looked at each other with tears in their eyes and said that the heroes had come. They had finally come. The battle for Sentinel Station Keth9 lasted 11 hours, and every single minute was a lesson in what humanity truly was. Yeltris watched from her damaged command center as the human fleet engaged the Vorthan swarm with weapons and tactics that the Concord had forgotten existed. The other species of the galaxy had observers scattered throughout the region, and they recorded everything with horrified fascination. Nobody had seen real warfare in 10,000 years, and what they witnessed that day would change the way they understood the universe. The human ships moved in patterns that seemed chaotic but were actually coordinated with terrifying precision. They communicated constantly using encrypted channels that shifted frequencies every few seconds, and the Vorthan could never jam their signals for long. When one ship was damaged, another would move to protect it, and when one fell, the others would avenge it with overwhelming force. But the most shocking thing was what happened when The Vorthen reached the station itself. The creatures had breached the outer hull in dozens of places, and their drones were pouring into the corridors to slaughter everyone inside. Ultras had resigned herself to death when the first human boarding pods slammed into the station. The pods tore through the damaged hull and disgorged soldiers in heavy armor who carried weapons in their hands and fury in their hearts. These humans did not fight from the safety of their ships or from orbit, where they could not be touched. They fought in the corridors face to face with the Vorthen drones, and they fought with a ferocity that made the aliens seem timid by comparison. Yeltris saw a human soldier tear a Vorthen drone apart with nothing but his armored hands after his weapon ran out of ammunition. She saw another hold the corridor alone for 20 minutes while civilians evacuated behind her. She saw humans die, and she saw other humans scream with rage and grief before throwing themselves back into the fight with renewed determination. A Talori diplomat named Varys approached Captain Vasquez during a brief pause in the fighting and asked a question that had been bothering him. Wanted to know why the humans did not simply bombard the Vorthen from orbit where they would be safe and distant. Captain Vasquez looked at him with eyes that carried the weight of too many battles and too many losses. She said that there were children on the station. She said that orbital bombardment might miss or might cause additional damage or might kill the very people they were trying to save. She said that humans did not take chances with children. Verse did not understand at first because the concept of risking your own life to avoid risking the lives of others seemed inefficient and illogical. But he watched the humans continue to fight and die in the corridors, and he began to realize that efficiency and logic were not what drove them. Something else was at work, and it was something that the Concorde had lost so long ago that they had forgotten it ever existed. The battle ended when the last Vorthen ship fled into hyperspace, and the last drone was killed in the lower levels of the station. The silence that followed was strange and heavy and filled with the sounds of survivors weeping with relief. Yeltris walked through the damaged corridors and witnessed things that confused her more than the battle itself. Human medics were treating Vorthen wounded with the same care they showed to their own injured soldiers. Human engineers were repairing station systems that they had no obligation to fix. Human soldiers who were still bleeding from their own wounds were carrying children to safety and speaking to them in soft, gentle voices. She saw a young human man with a terrible gash across his chest pick up a small Talori girl and call her sweetheart in a language that her translator rendered as pure warmth. The girl clung to him and cried, and he held her close and told her that everything was going to be okay. Now Yeltris found Captain Vasquez standing near an observation window, looking out at the wreckage of the battle. The view captain had blood on her uniform and exhaustion in her eyes, and something that looked like profound sadness in the lines of her face. Yeltris approached her and asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the humans first arrived. She asked why they had come and why they were helping and what they expected in return. Captain Vasquez turned to look at her and was quiet for a long moment before she answered. She said that they came because Yeltris had asked. She said that they came because someone was hurting people who could not fight back. She said that they came because humans remembered what it was like to have no one come when they called for help. Her voice became rough with emotion as she spoke, and Yeltris realized that this was not a speech that the captain had prepared. These were words from the heart, and they carried the weight of human history behind them. Vasquez said that long ago, on their own world, humans had suffered terribly and had called out for rescue that never came. She said that they had made a promise to themselves that they would never let others experience that same abandonment. She said that when someone called for help, humans answered. It was not complicated or strategic or political. It was simply what humans did because it was who humans were. Yeltris looked at this tired woman, covered in blood and surrounded by the wounded and the dead. She looked at the human soldiers still working to save lives that they had no connection to she looked at the medics treating enemies with compassion and the engineers fixing systems for strangers, and she understood something that the Galactic Concord had forgotten in 10,000 years of peace. True strength was not the ability to destroy. True strength was the willingness to sacrifice everything for people you had never met simply because they needed you. Humans were not just warriors. They were something far more rare and far more precious. They were protectors. The victory at Sentinel Station Keth-9 was celebrated across the galaxy, but the celebration was short and bitter. Vorthan swarm that had attacked the station was only a scouting force, and the real invasion fleet was still coming. Intelligence gathered from captured Vorthan vessels revealed a terrible truth that made the blood run cold in every species that heard it. Main swarm numbered over 1 billion ships, and it was 3 months away from the core worlds of the Galactic Concord. Everything that the humans had destroyed at Keth-9 was less than a fraction of a percent of the enemy force. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Galactic Concord held a war council on the ancient station of Nexus Prime. Representatives from all 17 species gathered in the Great Circular Chamber, where treaties had been signed and disputes resolved for millennia. The room was designed for diplomacy and compromise and peaceful negotiation. Now it would be used to plan the defense of civilization itself. Iltris attended as the representative of the Telori, and she took her place among beings who looked as lost and frightened as she felt. The Brevians, with their mathematical minds, sat in perfect stillness trying to calculate odds that kept coming up zero. The Lashi, with their biological gifts, shifted colors that indicated despair and confusion. The Keth, with their ancient wisdom, quoted old texts about acceptance and dignity in the face of inevitable ending. 16 species had gathered, and 16 species had nothing to offer but fear and resignation. They had scholars and artists and healers and builders, but they had no soldiers and no weapons and no memory of how to fight. The 17th delegation was small and entered the chamber. Last Captain Elena Vasquez walked in with Admiral James Chun and a young man whose name Yeltris would later learn was Marcus Webb. The humans wore simple uniforms that bore no decorations or symbols of rank beyond small metal pins on their collars. They did not look like the saviors of a galaxy, and they did not act like they expected worship or praise. They looked tired and worried and very, very human. Admiral Chun stood before the assembled representatives and waited for silence before he spoke. His voice was calm and measured and carried the authority of someone who had commanded fleets and won battles for decades. He said that the situation was serious but not hopeless. He said that humanity would fight the Vorthan with everything they had. But then he said something that shocked the entire assembly. He said that humanity could not win this war alone. The Bane had, but then he said something that shocked the entire assembly. He said that humanity Shantulis, the entire assembly. He said that humanity could not win this war alone. The chamber erupted in confused murmurs, because every species had assumed that the humans would simply fight the war for them. That was what the Concord wanted, and that was what they were prepared to pay for. They had already offered humanity technology and resources and entire worlds in exchange for their protection. Admiral Chun shook his head slowly and explained that humans were not mercenaries who killed for payment. He explained that the human fleet was large, but not large enough to defeat 1 billion Vorthan ships. He explained that even if humanity threw every soldier and every ship into the battle, they would only delay the inevitable. What was needed was not a mercenary force, but an alliance. What was needed was for every species in the Concord to remember what they had forgotten. The young man named Marcus Webb stepped forward and introduced himself as a historian who had studied every war that humanity had ever fought. His voice was softer than Admiral Chun, but it carried a different kind of weight. He said that he had also studied the history of every species in the Concord, and what he found had given him Opie said that the Talori had once fought a war against extinction that lasted 300 years and won. He said that the Brevians had developed weapons of pure mathematics that could shatter planets before they chose to forget such things. He said that the Aleshi had once been the most feared warriors in their region of space before they evolved to peace. He said that every species in the room had survived something terrible to reach this point in history. They had simply forgotten that they were survivors. The Concord had been at peace for so long that they had erased their own strength from their memory. They had become gentle and kind and civilized, and they had lost the part of themselves that knew how to stand against the darkness. Marcus Webb looked around the chamber with eyes that held both compassion and challenge. He said that humanity could teach them to fight. He said that humanity could help them remember the warriors they used to be, but more importantly, he said that each species had gifts that humanity did not possess. The Lori crystal work could disrupt Vorthan neural networks if weaponized Brevian mathematics could predict swarm patterns with perfect accuracy. Aleshi biotechnology might be able to communicate with the Vorthan Queen and perhaps end the war. Without total annihilation, every species had something to offer, and together they might achieve what none could accomplish alone. Admiral Chun spoke again, and his words were simple and direct. He said that humanity had spent 500 years preparing for a moment like this. He said that they had always known that someday they would need to help protect the galaxy that had welcomed them. Said that they had built their fleets and trained their soldiers and preserved their knowledge of war for this purpose. That they had never intended to be conquerors or rulers or the lone defenders of civilization. They wanted partners and allies and friends who would stand beside them in the darkness. The chamber was silent for a long moment as the weight of his words settled over the assembly. Then Yeltris stood and spoke for the first time since the council began. She said that she had watched humans die to save her people at Keth 9. She said that she had seen their compassion and their courage and their willingness to sacrifice everything for strangers. She said that if the humans believed the Concord could fight, then she believed it too. She said that the Talori would stand with humanity. One by one, the other species rose and made the same pledge. The War Council had become something else entirely. It had become an alliance. The transformation of the Galactic Concord began slowly and then accelerated beyond anything anyone had imagined possible. Human instructors spread across 100 worlds to teach species who had forgotten violence how to defend themselves. They did not try to turn artists into killers or scholars into mindless soldiers. Instead, they helped each species find their own path back to strength. The Talori were the first to rediscover their warrior heritage, and the process was both painful and beautiful to witness. Their crystalline bodies could resonate at frequencies that disrupted Vorthan neural patterns, but they had never considered using this ability as a weapon. A human combat instructor named Sergeant Maria Santos worked with a group of young Talori for 3 weeks before the breakthrough came. She did not teach them human fighting techniques because human bodies and Talori bodies were too different for that to work. Instead, she asked them to remember the stories their grandparents had told about the old wars. She asked them to sing the battle songs that had been preserved in their culture as curious historical artifacts. When the Talori sang together, their crystals vibrated in harmony, and the sound they produced could shatter Vorthan drones from 100 meters away. The first time they demonstrated this ability in combat training, the human observers stood in stunned silence. Sergeant Santos just smiled and said that she always knew they had it in them. The Brevians approached war as a mathematical problem, and their solutions were terrifying in their elegance. They could not fight directly because their bodies were fragile and their reflexes were slow, but they could predict Vorthan swarm movements with 99% accuracy up to 6 hours in advance. They developed tactical algorithms that turned the chaos of space combat into a precisely choreographed dance. Human admirals learned to trust Brevian predictions completely, and the combination of human aggression and Brevian foresight became devastating. In simulation after simulation, the Allied forces crushed Vorthan formations that should have been unbeatable. The Laship took the longest to find their contribution because their gifts were subtle and biological and impossible to rush. They could communicate through chemical signals and empathic connections, and they believed that all life was connected. Human scientists worked with Alashi biologists for weeks trying to establish some kind of contact with captured Vorthan specimens. Every attempt failed until an elderly Oleshi named Dev made a suggestion that changed everything. She proposed that instead of trying to talk to the Vorthan drones, they should try to reach the queen who controlled them. The queen was somewhere in the main swarm, directing billions of ships through a psychic link that spanned light years. Dev believed that if she could touch that link, she might be able to understand what the Vorthan truly wanted. The humans were skeptical, but they had learned to trust the wisdom of their new allies. They captured a Vorthan command drone and kept it alive while Dev attempted to connect with its mind. For 3 days nothing happened, and the military planners continued preparing for a conventional war. On the 4th day, Dev opened her eyes and began to weep. She said that she had found the queen, and she said that the Vorthan were not monsters. They were refugees. The Vorthan had fled from another galaxy where their homeworld had been destroyed by a cosmic catastrophe. They had been running for 100,000 years, and they had lost so much along the way. They had lost their culture and their art and their capacity for peace. All they had left was hunger and fear and the desperate need to survive at any cost. The queen did not want to destroy the Concord, but she did not know how to stop her. People had been running and fighting for so long that they had forgotten any other way to exist. When they've shared this knowledge with the War Council, the room fell silent. Admiral Chun was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. He said that this changed things, but it did not change the need to defend the Concord. He said that the Vorthan might be sympathetic, but they were still coming, and they would still kill billions if they were not stopped. But perhaps, he said, there was another way to end this war. Perhaps there was a way to fight that did not require the complete destruction of either side. The human historians had studied countless wars, and they knew that the best victories were the ones where the enemy became an ally. Captain Vasquez, who had been promoted to admiral after Keth9, proposed a plan that was either brilliant or insane. She suggested that they fight the Vorthan hard enough to prove that the Concord could not be conquered easily. Then she suggested that they offer the Vorthan what they truly wanted: a home, a place where they could stop running, a chance to remember who they used to be before the fear consumed them. Some members of the council objected and said that the Vorthan had killed too many people to deserve mercy. Others said that offering peace to an enemy who was still attacking was a sign of weakness. But Yeltris remembered what Captain Vasquez had told her at Keth9. She remembered that humans came because someone was hurting people who could not fight back, and she realized that they Vorthan were also people who could not fight back against their own fear and their own history. The Talori representative supported the plan, and the Brevians calculated that it had a 40% chance of success. The Leshi said that Dev was willing to serve as an ambassador to the Queen. One by one, the Alliance agreed to try. They would fight first because that was necessary, but they would also offer peace because that was right. Humanity would lead them in both endeavors, because that was what humanity did. The fleets began to gather, and the soldiers began to train, and somewhere in the darkness between stars, 1 billion Vorthan ships moved closer to the worlds they hoped to devour. The war was coming, but it was no longer hopeless. The galaxy had remembered how to fight. Now it would learn whether it could also remember how to forgive. The Vorthan swarm arrived at the edge of Concord space on a morning that would be remembered for 10,000 years. Admiral Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of the dreadnought, unconquered, and watched her tactical display fill with more enemy contacts than she could count. 1 billion ships moved through the darkness like a living storm, and behind them came the Queen vessel. The Queen ship was the size of a small moon, and it pulsed with the same hungry energy that drove every drone in. The swarm, this was the largest battle in the history of the galaxy, and humanity would lead the defense, but for the first time in their history, they would not fight alone. The Allied fleet numbered 200 million vessels drawn from every species. In the Conquer Nalori, crystal ships floated in formation, beside human carriers and Brevian command vessels. Coordinated movements across a front that spanned light years. The Keth had contributed their ancient generation ships as mobile fortresses. And even the peaceful Oleshi had sent medical vessels to support the wounded. Every species had given what they could, and together they had built something that had never existed before. A galaxy united against extinction, Admiral Vasquez addressed her fleet through a communication channel that reached every ship in the Alliance. She did not give a long speech, because she knew that words meant less than actions in moments like this. She simply said that they had all come a long way to reach. This day, she said that the enemy was vast, but the enemy could be defeated. She said that every species standing together today had forgotten their strength once, but they had remembered it now. And she said that humanity was proud to fight beside them then. She gave the order to attack. The first wave of human ships hit the Vorthan swarm like a hammer striking glass, and the impact shattered thousands of enemy vessels in seconds. Nuclear fire bloomed across the void, and Vorthan drones died by the millions as the Allies pressed their assault, but the swarm was vast beyond comprehension, and for every ship that fell, 10 more took its place. The Vorthan adapted to human weapons and began to swarm individual vessels with overwhelming numbers. The destroyer Defiance was torn apart by 1,000 drones, and its crew of 800 died screaming into the void. The carrier Remembrance lasted longer, but eventually even her massive hull could not withstand the endless assault. Human ships were dying, and the swarm kept coming, and for a terrible hour it seemed that all their preparation had been for nothing. Then the Talori joined the battle. There, crystal ships moved through the swarm in formations that seemed random but were actually ancient war patterns from their forgotten past. When they sang their battle songs together, the sound carried through space on frequencies that the Vorthan could not block. Drones convulsed and died as their neural networks overloaded, and entire sections of the swarm went dark. The Brevians had predicted exactly where the Vorthan would attempt to flank the Allied formation, and human ships were waiting in ambush. When the flanking force emerged from hyperspace, they were met with concentrated fire that annihilated them before they could engage. The battle became a dance of death that stretched across hours and light years. Both sides lost ships by the thousands, and then by the hundreds of thousands, and the void filled with wreckage and the bodies of the fallen admiral. Vasquez watched the casualty reports scroll across her screen and felt each number like a wound in her own flesh. She had sent millions of soldiers into this battle, and many of them would not return. But the line was holding. The Concord species, who had never fought in their lives, were standing firm beside human veterans. They were afraid, and they were dying, and they were magnificent. A young Talori captain named Varys led a squadron of crystal ships into the heart of the swarm to destroy. A Feyre captain named Varys led a squadron of crystal ships into the heart of the swarm to destroy. A heart of the swarm to destroy command node that was coordinating the assault. His ship was damaged within minutes, and his crew began to die around him, but he kept fighting. Broadcast a final message to the fleet saying that the Talori had found their courage again. Then his ship exploded, taking the command node and 10,000 drones with it across the battlefield. Similar acts of sacrifice were happening as soldiers from every species gave their lives for the Alliance. A Brevian mathematician named Keth locked herself in a sealed room and continued calculating swarm patterns even as her station collapsed around her. Final predictions saved 3 human carriers and 10,000 lives. An Oleshi healer named Dev continued treating the wounded on a medical ship. that was under direct attack. She refused to evacuate even when the hull was breached, and she died holding the hand of a young human soldier she had never met. War was terrible and beautiful, and it demanded everything from everyone who fought. By the 12th hour, the tide had turned. Allied forces had destroyed over 400 million Vorthan. Ships in the swarm was beginning to falter. The Queen vessel had stopped advancing and was now holding position at the center of her remaining forces. Something had changed in the patterns of the swarm, and the Brevian analysts reported that they, Vorthan, seemed confused. Admiral Vasquez saw her opportunity and ordered a pause in the attack. She opened a communication channel to the elder Elisha, named Dev, who had connected with the Queen weeks before. The old being was still alive against all odds, and she reported that the Queen was reaching out. The Queen wanted to talk. Vasquez ordered the fleet to hold position and prepare for anything. Then, she did something that no human commander had ever done before. She transmitted a message of peace to an enemy that had killed millions of her people. She said that the Concord had proven it could fight. Now she wanted to know if the Vorthan could learn to stop. The galaxy held its breath and waited for the answer. The silence stretched across the battlefield for 3 hours, while the May hours, while the Kuny hours, while the silence stretched across the battlefield for 3 hours, while the Pele galaxy waited. Admiral Vasquez remained on the bridge of the Unconquered, with her hand resting on the console that would order the fleet to resume firing. Her officers watched her with expressions that mixed hope and fear in equal measure. Vorthan's swarm had stopped attacking, but 500 million ships still hung in the void like a blade waiting to fall. One wrong word could restart the slaughter. The elder Elisha Dev worked in a sealed chamber at the heart of a medical ship, trying to establish a deeper connection with the Vorthan Queen. She had touched the Queen's mind once before, but that contact had been brief and painful. Now she was attempting something far more dangerous. She was trying to let the Queen speak through her. The process required Dev to lower all her mental defenses and allow an alien consciousness to enter her thoughts. If the Queen chose to attack instead of communicate, Dev would die instantly, but she had volunteered for this risk because she believed in the possibility of peace. She believed that the Vorthan were not monsters, but lost children who had forgotten their way home. The connection snapped into place like a bolt of lightning striking her mind, and Dev screamed once before her voice changed. Words that came from her mouth were not her own, and they carried the weight of 100,000 years of pain. The Queen spoke through Dev and said that she remembered a time before the running. She said that her people had once lived on a beautiful world covered in forests of crystal that sang in the wind. She said that they had been artists and builders, and they had created things of such beauty that even the stars seemed jealous. Then the catastrophe came, and everything they had built was destroyed. The survivors fled into the darkness between galaxies, and they kept running because they did not know how to stop. They became hungry because resources were scarce, and they became violent because violence was the only thing that kept them alive. The Queen said that she had watched her people lose themselves piece by piece over 100,000 years. She had watched them forget their art and their ash, music and their capacity for joy. She had watched them become the monsters that other species feared, and she had been unable to stop it because she was the Queen, and the Queen had to keep her people alive no matter the cost. The voice fell silent, and Dev collapsed unconscious. As the connection broke, the medical staff rushed to her side and reported that she was alive but deeply exhausted. Admiral Vasquez had listened to every word with tears streaming down her face. She understood now why the Vorthan had become what they were. He understood the terrible weight of leadership that forced you to make impossible choices to protect your people. And she understood that the Queen was tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. The Queen was tired of being a monster. Vasquez composed a response and transmitted it to the waiting swarm. She said that humanity knew what it was like to be afraid. She said that humans had fought wars among themselves for thousands of years before. They learned a better way, she said, that the galaxy was vast and there was room for the Vorthen to find a new home. She said that the Concord would offer them worlds where they could rebuild and remember who they used to be. She said that the killing could stop today if the Queen chose to let it stop. Another hour passed before the response came. Swarm began to move, and for a terrible moment, the Allied fleet prepared to resume battle. But the Vorthen ships were not attacking, they were forming a corridor through their ranks, and at the end of that corridor the Queen vessel waited. The Queen was inviting Admiral Vasquez to meet her face to face. The military advisors immediately objected and said it was obviously a trap. They said that no commander should risk herself in enemy territory. They said that the Alliance needed Vasquez alive to continue the fight if negotiations failed. Vasquez listened to all their objections, and then she ordered a shuttle prepared. She would go alone because bringing weapons or guards would send the wrong message. She would show the Queen that humans were capable of trust, even after everything that had happened. Captain Yeltris volunteered to accompany her and would not take no for an answer. She said that the Tolleri owed humanity a debt that could never be repaid. Said that if Vasquez was going to risk her life, then Yeltris would stand beside her. Two of them boarded a small shuttle and flew through the corridor of silent Vorthen ships. The journey took 20 minutes, and neither of them spoke because there were no words for what they were feeling. The Queen vessel opened its hull like a mouth, and the shuttle landed in a chamber that pulsed with organic light. Vasquez and Yeltris stepped out and found themselves facing the Vorthen Queen. She was enormous and beautiful and terrible all at once. Body filled the chamber like a living cathedral, and her many eyes watched the tiny beings who had come to speak with her. But what struck Vasquez most was the exhaustion in those ancient eyes. The Queen looked like someone who had been carrying an impossible burden for longer than she could remember. She looked like someone who wanted desperately to put that burden down. Vasquez stepped forward and spoke the words that she had been preparing for this moment. She said that the war could end here, and now she said that the Concord would welcome the Vorthen as members if they chose peace. She said that there would be no revenge and no punishment for what had been done. She said that everyone who had died would be honored by building a future where such deaths were never necessary again. Queen was silent for a long moment. Then she bent her massive head down until her eyes were level with the tiny human standing before her, and she spoke a single word that the translator rendered as acceptance. The war was over. The Vorthen had chosen peace. The celebration on Nexus Prime lasted for 7 days, and every species in the galaxy participated. Fireworks lit the skies of 1,000 worlds, and songs of victory echoed through stations and ships and colonies across the Concord. The war that should have ended civilization had instead created something new and unprecedented. A galaxy truly united for the first time in history. Vorthen were given 3 systems near the galactic rim where they could rebuild their civilization in peace. The Queen herself had begun the slow process of teaching her people to remember what they had lost. Young Vorthen were learning to create rather than destroy, and the first pieces of new art had already begun to appear. They were crude and simple compared to what their ancestors had made, but they were a beginning. Crystal forests of their ancient homeworld would never return, but perhaps something equally beautiful could grow in their place. Admiral Elena Vasquez stood on a balcony overlooking the celebration and watched the lights dance across the night sky. Her hair had gone gray during the war, and her face bore scars that would never fully heal, but her eyes held a peace that she had not felt in many years. She had lost so many people in the fighting, and she would carry their memories with her until she died. But they had not died for nothing. They had died to create this moment where 100 species could celebrate together in the light of a future that seemed bright. Yeltris found her there and stood beside her in comfortable silence for a long time. The Tolleri commander had changed as well during the war, and she no longer saw herself as a helpless bureaucrat waiting for rescue. She had led fleets into battle, and she had watched friends die, and she had discovered strength within herself that she never knew existed. She asked Vasquez a question that had been bothering her since the fighting ended. She asked why humans called themselves the backup when they had clearly been the leaders of the Alliance. Vasquez smiled at the question because it revealed how much Yeltris still did not understand about humanity. She said that humans had never wanted to lead the galaxy. She said that humans had built their fleets and trained their soldiers because they knew that someday the Concord might need protection. She said that humans had always intended to stand behind the other species rather than in front of them. Real heroes, she said, were the species who had forgotten how to fight and then remembered when it mattered most. Real heroes were the Talori who learned to sing their battle songs. Again, the real heroes were the Brevians who turned their mathematics into weapons. The real heroes were the Aleshi who reached across the void to touch an alien mind and find common ground. The real heroes were everyone who had been afraid and fought anyway, because the alternative was unthinkable. Humans had simply reminded them of what they already possessed. Vasquez said that humanity understood something that the Concord had forgotten. She said that every species that reached the stars had survived terrible things along the way. She said that the capacity for courage and sacrifice was not unique to humans, but was part of every intelligent species in the universe. The Concord had simply been at peace so long that they had forgotten this truth about themselves. They had looked at humanity and seen warriors, but that was only half the story. The other half was that humanity saw potential warriors in everyone else. Yeltris considered these words for a long time before she responded. She said that before the war she had thought humans were strange and inexplicable. She said that she had not understood why they preserved their knowledge of violence when everyone else had chosen to forget. She said that she had thought humans were perhaps dangerous or unstable or simply less evolved than the peaceful species of the Concord. Now she understood that humans were none of those things. Humans were gardeners who had spent 5 centuries preparing to help a galaxy grow. They had kept their swords sharp, not because they loved violence, but because they knew that someday the flowers would need protecting, and when the time came, they had not simply fought the battle themselves, they had taught the flowers how to grow thorns. The two friends stood together and watched the celebration continue. Below them, somewhere in the crowd, a group of Talori children were playing with human children, and their laughter echoed across the plaza. Somewhere else, Vorthan delegation was learning to eat food instead of consuming living things, and their hosts were patient with their clumsy attempts. Somewhere else, a monument was being planned to honor all those who had died in the war, regardless of what species they belonged to. The galaxy had been transformed, and it would never return to what it had been before. But perhaps that was a good thing. Years later, when historians wrote about the Vorthan War, they struggled to answer a simple question: who were the heroes of this story? Some said it was the humans who came when called and taught the galaxy to fight. Some said it was the Concord species who rediscovered their ancient strength. Some said it was the Vorthan who chose peace over extinction at the very last moment. The human historians always smiled when asked this question and gave the same answer. They said that everyone was the hero. They said that this was the point. They said that this had always been the point. And in the archives of Earth, in a file marked First Contact Protocols, there remained a single line that had been written 5 centuries earlier and never changed. The line said that when they call, we answer. It said that when they fall, we catch them. It said that when they forget what they are, we remind them. Said that this is what humans do. It said that this is what humans have always done. And now a galaxy full of species understood what those words truly meant. They meant that no one was ever truly alone. They meant that help would always come if you had the courage to ask. They meant that the real heroes were not the ones who fought the hardest. The real heroes were the ones who taught. others to fight for themselves, and in teaching them to fight, they also taught them the most human lesson of all that. True strength is not measured by what you can destroy. It is measured by what you choose to protect the end.